Have you ever been dismissed by someone simply because they thought you didn't matter? And do you remember how your heart tightened in that moment? How something inside you quietly folded in on itself? On flight LA 421 that morning, a veteran pilot, a man who once believed the sky belonged to him, brushed off a simple greeting from a black woman sitting in first class. Just a nod, a glance, the smallest gesture of respect. But he didn't do it. He had no idea that the woman he ignored was actually the new CEO of the airline. And she wasn't on that flight to relax. She was there to evaluate him, his character, his humanity. Now, imagine this. If one day you accidentally treated someone poorly, someone who held the power to shape your entire future, what would you do? Would you defend yourself? Would you shut down? Or would you have the courage to look inward? Would you cling to the old cycle of pride or choose the one chance? You have to change your life, because this isn't just a story about a pilot and a missed greeting. It's a story about how a person confronts their own mistakes, about choosing between self-protection and growth, between ego and humanity. And if you've ever been misunderstood, ever been underestimated, or ever hurt someone without realizing it, this story will reach you. So drop a like, share this video, and subscribe, because we're about to take off on a journey of change and healing. Are you ready? The cockpit of the Boeing 787 always carried a kind of light that no one could ever fully describe. Not too bright, not too dim, just a soft wash of blue glowing from the control panels, like the quiet breath of some giant creature waiting to be awakened. In that glow, the features of Captain Jordan Miles stood out clearly, calm, cool, and so confidently composed it felt like nothing in the world could shake him. Jordan stood in front of his seat, one hand resting lightly on the armrest, as if reacquainting himself with his rightful throne. For him, every flight began with this exact moment: 30 seconds of silence in a space filled only with the faint hum of electricity, the muted blue lights, and the feeling that he was exactly where he belonged. Here, he didn't have to argue with anyone. No one questioned his authority. Up in the sky, Jordan was truly himself, or rather the version of himself he wanted the world to see. He drew in a long breath, letting his lungs fill with the scent of new plastic and the warm, electric smell of the panel sand aroma that, no matter how many years passed, still grounded him every time he returned to it. Behind him, the cockpit door clicked shut, a soft talk that sounded like the final punctuation of an old chapter before a new journey began. Jordan narrowed his eyes slightly, looking out through the cockpit window. The runway at Atlanta Airport glowed like a miniature city. Lights lined up in perfect rows, stretching into infinity like silver threads, guiding him toward the sky. For a fleeting second, he felt as if he were standing before a throne, and this 787 was his loyal, powerful steed waiting for his command. A young flight attendant passed by the cockpit door, spotted him, and offered a polite smile. He gave a small nod, in return just enough to be courteous, but nowhere near enough to invite conversation. He had carried himself this way for years, a calmness with a faint chill, a demeanor so tightly sealed it allowed no one a peek inside. Jordan believed he was born to command the sky, not in a reckless or boastful way, but in a quiet, bone-deep certainty. His father, a former military pilot, once told him when he was just 10, "You don't need to talk much, just fly well. Do that, and you'll have all the authority you need." Jordan remembered those words for the rest of his life. Before passengers began boarding, he ran through his checklist in the cabin. His fingers skimmed over each familiar switch, quick, precise, instinctive. Every touch was a confirmation he was in control. He understood every detail, and he alone would decide what would happen in the hours ahead. Yet, right at the moment he tilted his head to check the pressure gauge, a narrator's voice seemed to slip into the story, low, steady, almost whispering something beyond his grasp. Just one ignored greeting, and his entire life veered onto a pock-and-chi, different path. The words sliced through the quiet like a sharp line drawn across the scene. No warning, no explanation. Just a lingering echo that made the listener pause and wonder. What greeting? Who greeted him? And why could it matter that much? But in the cockpit, Jordan remained blissfully unaware. He continued adjusting the preset altitude. Numbers shifted across the screen, reflecting in his gray-blue eyes. He had no idea that in just a few minutes the footsteps of a woman would stop at the cockpit door, and his silence, that familiar, harmless silence of his, would become the spark that ignited the greatest turning point of his life. A tiny moment, a thoughtless action, But fate sometimes only needs the space of a single breath to change direction. Jordan stood there, a man convinced he was in complete control of his destiny. But destiny was already writing a new page waiting for him to step into it without even realizing. And the key that unlocked that door was just a greeting he would not answer. Texas Jordan Miles' hometown was the kind of place where the fields stretched so far they seemed to scrape the edge of the horizon. On hot summer afternoons, the dry wind swept across old wooden fences, carrying with it the scent of sun-scorched grass. Jordan grew up between the vastness of the sky and the harshness of the land conditions that forced people to toughen up just a little more if they wanted to make it. Jordan's father, Benjamin Miles, was a former military pilot, a man built from the values of an older generation. A man of few words, disciplined to the bone, and convinced that real men grow by learning to stand up after every fall. He never hugged Jordan for more than 3 seconds, never praised him outright, but whenever he reached out to straighten his son's collar before school, Jordan understood that was his father's version of affection. Jordan remembered those early mornings in their simple wooden house. His father brewed thick black coffee in an old metal pot. The smell drifting into the kitchen each morning was what signaled to Jordan that a new day had begun. Benjamin would sit at the table reading the newspaper, the worn pilot's watch on his wrist, catching the first light of dawn. 8-year-old Jordan would just sit quietly observing. One morning, his father spoke slowly without looking at him. "In life, you don't need to complain. You just need to be better than the rest." That sentence stayed with Jordan for years, like an invisible thread pulling him forward, while also tightening around his emotions. Jordan's teenage years looked nothing like those of other kids. While his friends ran around the football field or went fishing by the lake, Jordan spent his time watching his father polish every detail of his old flight suit, every patch, every faded stitch. Benjamin didn't share many stories from his past, but the wear on that pilot's watch carried a lifetime of them. Jordan would stare at it and see the road he believed he was meant to follow. When Jordan turned 17, Benjamin took him to the small airport on the edge of town. It was Jordan's first time sitting inside a training aircraft, a Cessna 172. It was August, and the sun poured straight into the cockpit, hot enough that his palms were sweating. But the moment the propeller began to spin, Jordan felt his heart pound to a different rhythm. And when the wheels finally lifted off the ground, something inside him broke free. He felt himself rising above the quiet, struggling little town, above pressures he couldn't name, above the tightness that had lived in his chest for as long as he could remember. From that moment on, Jordan didn't just enjoy flying. He needed it. It was the only way he knew to prove himself worthy of the enormous shadow cast by his father. As the years passed, Jordan entered an aviation academy. He became one of the top students, always leading in flight control assessments and emergency scenario simulations. But the better he got, the quieter he became. He built an invisible wall around himself, not out of dislike for others, but because he believed emotions made people weak. During those late-night training sessions, classmates sometimes invited him out for food. Jordan would only shake his head, saying he needed more time to review his checklist. That coldness wasn't natural, it was shaped by thousands of reminders from his father and the environment he grew up in. He believed discipline required standing above emotion, never showing softness, never letting anyone see hesitation, fear, or doubt. And so piece by piece, Jordan's personality hardened into armor. When Jordan was officially hired by Liberty Air, he became one of the youngest pilots qualified to fly the Boeing 787. At the time, he thought all his hard work had finally paid off. People said he was born to fly, but no one ever told him that to become a true leader, skill alone would never be enough. Years went by, and Jordan kept his routine of arriving at the airport earlier than everyone else. He parked in the employee lot, stepped out with a cup of steaming black coffee in hand, its smoke curling in the cool morning breeze. He always paused for a few seconds, looking out at the planes resting silently in the sunrise, feeling like this was exactly where he belonged. But that sense of belonging came with a quiet distance between him and the people he worked with. Jordan didn't dislike anyhow, he simply believed other people would distract him. A pilot, according to his father's philosophy, needed a cold mind and a hard heart. And Jordan believed that so deeply, he never realized he was pushing everyone away. He didn't know that this very closed-off nature, when tested by a small but perfectly timed event, would become the strongest headwind of his life. He lifted his father's pilot watch, tightened the metal strap gently, then set it back on his wrist. A new flight day was beginning. and his life was approaching a turning point he wasn't prepared for. Maybe if Jordan had known the journey of the woman sitting in seat 2, Hay wouldn't have brushed off her greeting so easily. But life has a strange elegance to it. It makes people cross paths at the exact moment they think they don't need anyone. And in those seemingly insignificant seconds, truth starts to reveal itself. Maya Thompson, the new CEO of Liberty Air, wasn't the type who enjoyed fancy introductions. If anyone asked her how she climbed all the way to the top, she would just smile and say, "It was a long road, but I made it here." People usually assumed she was being modest. But in reality, Maya was simply saving her breath for things that mattered more. Because the real story behind that sentence was much, much longer. Maya was born in Charlotte, North Carolina, into an ordinary working-class family. Her mother worked night shifts as a nurse. Her father was a plumber. They weren't wealthy, but they carried themselves with pride and a quiet dignity. Maya grew up believing that with enough effort, she deserved any place she aimed for in society. But that belief was shaken for the first time in the summer of 1998. 16-year-old Maya was on the very first commercial flight of her life, a worn Boeing 727 flying from Atlanta to Denver. She remembered the thrill of buckling her seatbelt, imagining herself stepping into a world far bigger than the small yellow house she grew up in. But the moment that chilled her heart wasn't the rumble of the engines at takeoff. It was the look on a flight attendant's face after Maya asked to change seats because the man beside her was harassing her. The attendant glanced at Maya from head to toe, then replied with a voice cold as metal, "If you want to switch seats, learn to deal with it. It's only a 2.5-hour flight. No concern. No sympathy." And what hurt Maya the most, she knew deep down that if she hadn't been a black girl, the answer might have been very different. When the plane landed that night, Maya stepped off with a feeling like someone had scraped a long, raw line across her heart. She didn't cry. She simply understood one truth. When people have power, they can choose to use it to lift someone up or to make them smaller. And from that day on, Maya made her own choice. She would become someone who created change. Years later, Maya entered the aviation industry not to fly, but to lead. She had an MBA, a formidable background in crisis management, and she had once pulled a struggling regional airline back from the edge of bankruptcy. But what drew the attention of major corporations wasn't just her skill set. It was the way she spoke to janitors the same way she spoke to CFOs. The way she listened to technicians more carefully than to polished presentations. When Liberty Air began searching for a new CEO, the board spent 6 months interviewing, evaluating, negotiating. But it took them only 3 minutes to decide Maya was the right person after she delivered this line in the final meeting. "Liberty Air doesn't fly on engines. It flies on people. And if the culture inside starts to crack, no plane in the world is big enough to hide it." She was appointed CEO with deep respect from many and quiet skepticism from others. Not everyone was ready to accept a black woman as the head of an airline in an industry riddled with unspoken biases. But Maya refused to let that shake her. 6 months after taking office, internal reports began reaching her desk. Pilots showing disrespect toward cabin crew, short tempers in the cockpit, poor cooperation between flight teams, passenger complaints about attitude, low ratings on several flights due to bad customer experience. Maya knew these issues never appeared outright in meetings. They lived in the look of a tired drink server, in the awkward silence of a first officer, in the quiet sigh of a passenger stepping off the plane. So she made a decision: she would get on the plane herself as an ordinary passenger. No announcement, no assistant, no security detail. Just a navy blazer, a compact handbag, and the notebook she always carried. The chosen flight, LA 421 from Atlanta to Seattle. Captain in command Jordan Miles. She had read Jordan's file. Talented, exceptionally so. But every evaluation came with the same missing piece: humility. That morning when Maya walked into the departure lounge, her heart was calm, smooth like a lake before the wind. But deep beneath that calm lay something old and familiar, the memory of being dismissed in 1998, a memory that never truly faded. It stayed with her, reminding her why she had to do what she did. She didn't want anyone else, no child, no passenger, no employee to experience that kind of dismissal. And it was precisely because of that reason that as Maya prepared to board flight LA 421, she had no idea fate was quietly looping her back to the very wound that once shaped her. Only this time, and then the moment arrived, soft as a breath, yet powerful enough to shift the trajectory of an entire. entire life. As Maya stepped out of the jet bridge and into the aircraft, she felt her heartbeat slow for just a second. Not from nerves, but from familiarity, the kind that comes from experience, from knowing that sometimes the biggest things begin with the smallest details. The Boeing 787 operating flight LA421 sat still, as if waiting for someone to wake it. The cool air in the cabin made Maya inhale deeply. Warm yellow lights cascaded softly over the rows of seats, offering comfort without extravagance. Passengers were still sparse. Most were arranging bags or searching for their seats, but in Maya's mind everything moved at a slower, separate frame. Karen Douglas, the lead flight attendant, stood near the cockpit greeting customers. She was a woman in her early 40s, sharp eyes but gentle. Someone who had seen enough to know exactly when to speak and when silence was the kinder choice. When she saw Maya step aboard, Karen flashed a bright, professional smile layered with warmth. "Welcome aboard flight LA421. Hope you have a pleasant journey." Maya returned her smile soft, composed, the kind of smile that steadied the person who received it. "Thank you. Wishing your crew a smooth flight." Her voice was gentle, but clear, like a breeze gliding over a still lake, quiet, but carrying a depth hard to describe. Karen smiled again, unaware that just a few hours later Maya would be seated in a meeting where her name would come up. But that was for the future. Right now, everything seemed like an ordinary flight. As Maya approached the cockpit door, she did what any courteous passenger would do. She paused for a moment, offered a polite smile, and said, "Wishing you gentlemen a safe flight." A simple sentence, warm, expecting nothing in return. Inside the cockpit, First Officer Liam Perez was running a navigation systems check. Hearing her greeting, he turned immediately, smiling back with genuine appreciation. Liam was nearly a decade younger than Jordan, and his eyes always carried an earnest respect for people. "Thank you very much. We'll do our best to keep it smooth." But the kindness in Liam's expression contrasted sharply with the man in the left seat. Captain Jordan Miles didn't turn his head. He heard the greeting, there was no missing it at that distance. But his eyes stayed locked on the control panel, fingers moving from switch to switch, as if no one else existed outside himself and the machine. No glance, no acknowledgement, not even the smallest gesture of courtesy. Nothing. The moment lasted only a few seconds, yet long enough for Karen to catch it from the corner of her eye. She blinked, surprised by Jordan's indifference. She'd heard countless compliments about his flying skills, but never once about his people skills. Liam shot Jordan a cautious look, a tiny reminder in his voice, "Captain." He said it softly, trying to salvage a shred of cockpit courtesy. Jordan answered with two words so cold they seemed to pull the air down with them, "Closed door." "Not please. Not a thank you. Just an order." Liam froze for a fraction of a second before giving a reluctant nod. He signaled Karen, who understood immediately, though a small heaviness settled in her chest. She shut the cockpit door. The soft thud felt like a full stop. But to Maya this was only the opening line. She didn't show a flicker of emotion. She simply stood straight, offered a polite smile, and continued walking down the aisle. But inside, a mental note had already taken shape. Captain showed lack of respect toward passenger. Did not respond to greeting, possible dismissiveness. Not a judgment, not anger, just data and observation. And Maya believed every piece of data mattered. No one on the aircraft knew she was the CEO of Liberty Air. No one knew their actions would soon appear in a report seen only by the highest executives. And most importantly, no one knew that Jordan's silence, that small but razor-sharp discourtesy, would become the first pebble rolling down the slope of his career. When Maya settled into seat 2A, she placed her bag under the seat, then pulled out a black leather notebook. Her fingers brushed its cover gently, as though touching a story from the past, a story that once hurt her, but also shaped her into who she became. This wasn't the notebook of a powerful CEO leading a major airline. This was the notebook of a 16-year-old girl who had once been dismissed, who vowed no one else should ever feel the way she did. She wrote a brief, emotionless line: boarding. Captain Miles, no response to greeting. Then she lifted her head, watching the incoming passengers fill the aisle, feeling her heartbeat settle once more. This was the calm before a strong wind, a thin, delicate, quiet one that anyone perceptive enough could sense it wouldn't last long. None of them, not Jordan, not Liam, not Karen, realized the moment that just passed was the ignition point. They only knew the flight was about to begin. But Maya knew that the evaluation of culture always starts with the smallest details. In Flight LA 421 had just written the opening line of a story they would all have to face. She would face it from a position of power. When the cockpit door closed, everything inside the aircraft seemed to slip into a different layer of air quiet, but not the quiet of peace. It felt more like standing at an intersection just before the light changes when someone deep inside knows something is shifting, even if no one has said a word. And within that quiet, the true nature of Captain Jordan Miles began to surface. Jordan pulled his seat forward with precise, clipped movements, nothing wasted, nothing soft. He adjusted his harness, eyes fixed on the control panel. He didn't mention the incident at the cockpit doorway, nor did he intend to. To Jordan, passengers weren't the priority. The aircraft was the priority. And in his world, some things simply did not qualify as worth his attention. Unfortunately for him, that was the first detail Maya recorded. Liam sat to the right, reviewing the startup checklist. He glanced at Jordan a few times, looking for a chance to say something to pull the atmosphere back toward the cooperation that cockpit operations required. But Jordan's cold demeanor pushed every attempt back into silence. Jordan placed his hand on the control column and spoke in a tone that wasn't loud, but heavy enough to make the listener feel they'd been nudged down a rung. Engine start checklist. Not a request, a command. Liam replied quickly. Copy. Engine start checklist. He began reading each item, his voice professional, but a little strained. Jordan responded with short, clipped phrases, sometimes only a single checked. Everything followed procedure, but one thing was missing: the respect that makes true cockpit teamwork possible. As the engine spooled up, Liam leaned forward to examine the readings. He noticed a secondary display showing a slightly elevated temperature on the right side. Nothing dangerous, just a deviation that a young pilot would naturally want to double-check. He hesitated, then spoke. Captain, the right side temps a bit high, around 5%. Maybe we should. Jordan cut him off immediately. Normal fluctuation. Don't overthink it. His voice wasn't sharp, wasn't raised, but carried a clear message. You're worrying about something unimportant. Liam swallowed, unsure. I just want to make sure. Jordan didn't let him finish. Perez, I've flown this aircraft longer than you've had a career. Don't let tiny numbers distract you. Simple words, but cruel, in effect pushing Liam into the exact slot. Jordan wanted him to occupy quieter, smaller, less trusted. A familiar ache stung inside Liam's chest. Not anger, just the quiet pain of someone who only wanted to do things right yet kept being dismissed. He exhaled softly, wondering, I'm just trying to help. Why does that feel so hard? No one heard the question, but it seeped into the air of the cockpit, subtle as a shift in breathing, present in the tiny spaces between their replies. Jordan didn't notice or didn't care to. He was accustomed to absolute control. He believed firmness was necessary for smooth operations to ensure everyone stayed in their lane. But firmness without respect is simply another form of suppression. In the business cabin, Maya fastened her seatbelt and leaned back lightly. She opened her notebook again, not writing anything, yet just resting her pen against a blank page. She didn't need to be inside the cockpit to understand what was happening. What she witnessed earlier, the way Jordan ignored a passenger's greeting, then immediately dismissed his colleague's input, already painted the first strokes of the cultural landscape she was here to evaluate. From seat 2, as she could faintly hear the exchanges up front. Jordan's voice steady, clipped. Liam's softer, cautious. They weren't arguing, but they weren't in sync either. And Maya knew one truth better than most. A safe flight depends not only on skill, but on trust in the flight deck. Trust, something she had yet to hear between Jordan and Liam. Karen passed by, doing a final sweep of the cabin before takeoff. Maya watched as she straightened a pillow and picked something up off the floor. That small attention to detail warmed Maya's chest, because she knew people like Karen were the heart of aviation. But that heart only beats strong when the person in charge respects it. And Jordan, Maya drew a quiet breath, deep but calm. She didn't rush to conclusions. She observed, and she waited. In the cockpit, Jordan flipped on the taxi lights and said curtly, "Ready for pushback." His tone was so even it felt emptied of any emotion. He didn't glance at Liam, didn't ask for confirmation, as if all decisions defaulted to him alone. Liam contacted ground control, then relayed the clearance. Jordan nodded once. No further comment. As the aircraft began to roll back from the gate, the cool blue glow of the flight deck washed over Jordan's face. In that light, he looked like someone completely detached from the world around him, someone who believed that he and the aircraft were all that mattered. Maya looked out the business class window and watched the wing catch the morning sun. It was beautiful, peaceful, even, but something inside her stirred in instinct, whispering that this calm was only the surface of water about to break into waves. Jordan still had no idea that every choice he made, every word, every muscle tightened in irritation, every dismissive glance was already finding its place quietly, methodically in Maya's leather notebook. And the flight had only just begun. Just like a seemingly calm lake hiding the movement of water beneath its surface, the cockpit of LA 421 was entering the stage where the first ripples began to show. After the aircraft pushed back from the gate and taxied toward the runway, the air inside the cockpit remained quiet. Enough that every button click and every soft breath from the two pilots sounded like it echoed inside the space between them. And then it happened. As Jordan advanced the throttles to begin rolling onto the main taxiway, a number on the secondary display flickered. Not a red alert, not a serious malfunction. Just a subtle shift in the right fuel, pressurizing, then dipping unpredictably for 2 or 3 seconds. Liam immediately leaned in for a better look. It wasn't the kind of anomaly a responsible pilot would ignore. He steadied himself and opened the electronic checklist. Captain Liam said, keeping his voice as calm as possible, the right side fuel pressure is fluctuating a bit. I recommend we run the checklist just to make sure there's no issue with the fuel pump. Jordan glanced at the display with barely any interest. Stable now, he said. Just a minor fluctuation. Liam persisted, gently, voice low but steady. Yes, I see it's back to normal, but the checklist requires. Jordan cut him off sharper this time. Perez, I said it's fine. I've been flying this type for 10 years. I know what's worth worrying about and what isn't. Liam froze for a split second. Not because Jordan raised his voice, he hadn't. It was because Jordan's words shut like a door slamming in his face. A clear message. Your input matters less than my instincts. Outside the cockpit, Karen was adjusting the intercom to communicate with the cabin crew. But when she caught fragments of their conversation through the narrow gap of the door, her hand stopped midair. I know, nothing to worry about. Checklist not needed. She paused for several seconds. 15 years in the industry taught her one truth. A pilot dismissing a checklist is always a bad sign. Checklists exist to prevent mistakes, not to be treated as suggestions. Karen couldn't intervene. A cabin crew were not permitted to influence cockpit decisions. But a small knot of concern tightened in her chest. Because at 35000 feet, every detail matters. In business class, Maya set her pen down. She hadn't heard the full exchange, only the tone firm and unyielding, the other soft and hesitant in a small, almost imperceptible sigh. But Maya didn't need the full conversation to understand. She'd witnessed this dynamic dozens of times across her career. One person so confident they believed instinct outweighed procedure. Another trying to fulfill their responsibility only to be dismissed. A thought crossed Maya's mind. A leader who won't allow input is the most dangerous kind. The sentence echoed in her mind like a low bell. Not out of judgment, not out of anger, but out of experience. She'd encountered too many people like that, those who believe that because they had been right once, they would always be right. Liam sat still, eyes fixed forward. He didn't want to escalate tension. He respected seniority. He respected Jordan's experience. But the checklist wasn't optional. It existed not for new pilots, but for all pilots. A familiar question tugged at him. Why is doing the right thing always the hardest thing to say? He didn't want to argue. He just wanted to do his job, to keep everyone safe. But Jordan didn't see that. Or he chose not to. Jordan taxied the aircraft to the runway. His voice as steady as ever, cleared for takeoff. Set throttle. Liam complied, saying nothing more. The fuel pressure had stabilized, it was true. But that wasn't the real issue. The true issue was how the captain responded to a deviation. Wind slid across the wings as the engines roared, pushing the aircraft faster down the runway. Karen sat strapped into her jump seat up front, replaying the brief conversation she'd overheard. She tightened her harness and felt the vibration of the aircraft beneath her silently, hoping she had misunderstood what she'd heard. Maya leaned her head slightly toward the window. As the aircraft lifted off the ground, she placed her hand on the notebook, but didn't write yet. She wanted to observe what else the journey would reveal. Jordan, meanwhile, paid no attention to anything shifting in the cabin behind him. In his mind, there were only two things, the aircraft and himself. Everything else, his colleagues, concerns, the passengers' reactions, faded into the background. He believed that made him stronger. But strength without awareness is just armor fastened too tightly, tight enough that no one else can stand beside you. Once the aircraft leveled off at initial altitude, Jordan carried himself like a man who had just won a small victory. No warnings, no failures, no consequences. He leaned back slightly and spoke with a tone halfway between lecturing and mocking. "See, you worry about things that don't matter." Liam answered only, "Yes, Captain." Two short words, but heavy with everything he couldn't say. The most painful part wasn't the disagreement, it was the silence that followed, the silence that lingered when someone desperately needed to speak but couldn't. In business class, Maya finally wrote a new note in her notebook. Minor technical anomaly, FO recommended checklist. Captain refused. Relied on intuition over procedure. Leadership lacks openness to feedback. Her handwriting was calm, measured. But every line was a small incision into the picture. Jordan still believed he was painting flawlessly. Maya closed her eyes for a moment. She understood something clearly. This was only the first test, and Jordan had already failed it without even knowing he was being tested. The small technical glitch had settled, and the cabin slipped back into a quiet that felt almost untouched. But sometimes that calm is nothing more than the pause before the next test zone that doesn't come from machinery or systems but from people themselves. And this test was small, yet enough to peel back another layer of Jordan's personality on. He worked hard to hide behind his cool facade. About 20 minutes after takeoff, Karen began her routine walkthrough of the cabin. When she reached a row near the left side windows, she spotted a little boy around 8 years old curled up in his seat, hands pressed over his ears, body trembling. His mother leaned over him, whispering reassurance, but it wasn't helping. The boy wasn't whining. He wasn't acting out. He was genuinely afraid. Karen knelt down gently so her eyes met his. "What's your name, honey?" "Dee Danny." His voice shook like it might break apart. "Are you scared of the engine noise?" Danny nodded quickly, eyes welling with tears. Karen gave his mother a soft, understanding look. She had handled situations like this many times, and there was a method that usually helped: a quick visit to the cockpit, asking the pilots to offer a brief message of reassurance. Hearing the calm voice of the person flying the plane often worked wonders for frightened kids. So Karen stood up and made her way toward the cockpit. Inside, Jordan and Liam were monitoring the flight. No issues, but the tension from earlier still clung to the air like static. Liam stayed silent, and Jordan clearly wasn't planning to break the quiet. Karen knocked lightly. Liam turned first, cracked the door open, and greeted her with a warm smile. "What's up, Karen?" Karen kept her voice low but clear. "There's a little boy about 8 really scared of flying. I think if the captain could say a few reassuring words or send a quick message, it might help him feel safe." Liam was about to agree. He'd done this before. It worked amazingly well. But Jordan turned in his seat before Liam could speak, cutting the moment in half. "Tell him life is tough. This shouldn't be a problem." Jordan's tone wasn't joking. No warmth, no empathy. Just a flat wall of indifference. Karen stopped cold. Liam's eyes widened, too blunt, too cold for a frightened child. Karen tried again, a little more gently. "Captain, he's really panicking. If you could just say—" Jordan lifted his hand, slicing through the air to shut down the conversation. "Karen, I'm flying the airplane, not running a therapy class. Do your job. I'll do mine." The words landed hard. Karen froze, a swell of helplessness tightening her chest. She glanced toward Liam, quiet, apologetic, but Liam could only give the smallest shake of his head. Not because he agreed with Jordan, but because he didn't have the authority to intervene. She closed the cockpit door softly and walked back toward the cabin. Her steps were heavier now. From seat 2, Amaya didn't hear the full conversation, but she heard enough. Jordan's voice, cold, clipped, cutting like a blade. Karen's voice as she returned, smaller, deflated, as if she'd just been shoved backward without being touched. Maya closed her eyes for a heartbeat. What she pictured wasn't Karen. Wasn't Danny. It was herself, 10-year-old Maya. She remembered shaking in her seat on that old Boeing 727. She remembered tugging a flight attendant's sleeve and whispering, "Can the pilot say something to help me not be scared?" And what she got wasn't comfort. just the dismissive look of an adult who saw a child's fear as trivial. A look that made her heart shrink like a leaf in harsh wind. She had never forgotten that feeling, the realization that her fear, her fragility, wasn't worth a second of someone else's time. And now on flight LA 421, she was watching that moment replay itself for another child. The loop repeated, except this time the silent observer had grown up, carried scars of her own, and had the power to stop it. Karen returned to Danny. She didn't tell him the truth that the pilot refused. Instead, she smiled sadly and said softly, "The pilot is busy flying the plane, sweetheart, but I'm here with you. You're safe. I'll sit with you a little while." Danny didn't know what had happened, but he felt the sincerity in her eyes. His breathing eased. Maya watched the scene from afar. Something inside her tightened, not because Jordan lacked courtesy, not because he lacked compassion, but because he was reinforcing a culture she had spent half her life trying to dismantle. She opened her notebook and wrote clearly. Captain refused to assist a young passenger. No empathy. Negative impact on leadership culture. Her pen pressed a little harder this time. Not from anger, but from the understanding that she now needed to document everything carefully. In the cockpit, Jordan settled back, adjusting the autopilot. He looked perfectly unbothered, convinced none of what just happened was his concern. Liam felt different. He stole a glance at Jordan before looking forward again. Thoughts knotted tight. Why can't he soften just for a moment? One sentence, that's all it would take. But Liam didn't voice it. No one did. And the silence, just like before, spoke, louder than any argument could. Jordan didn't realize that with every sentence he spoke, another line was forming in the leather notebook of Seat 2 aliens that would soon shape the verdict of his entire career. The flight continued, but the sky was beginning to change, and the next test was already on its way. After the small incident with little Danny, the atmosphere aboard Flight LA 421 seemed to dip by one subtle tone. Karen still forced a smile as she moved through the cabin. Liam stayed focused on the screens in front of him, and Mayathoff, no one knew, continued observing everything with the eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime watching hard truths play out. What no one said aloud was the quiet suspicion beginning to settle into every corner of the aircraft, a feeling like a smooth lake with currents starting to twist just beneath the surface. And the wave arrived, but from the sky. The weather radar suddenly lit up in streaks of yellow and orange across the eastern path of their route. Liam leaned forward, brow furrowing. Radar didn't lead. There was a large turbulence cell forming ahead. He inhaled softly, keeping his voice steady. "Captain, there's a storm cell about 40 miles ahead. I recommend deviating about 15 degrees to avoid the turbulence." Jordan glanced at the radar for barely a second before turning back to the main display, as if he'd just glanced at something trivial. "No need. We've got enough distance." Liam checked the radar again. This wasn't a matter of opinion. "Yes, Captain, but the cell is growing quickly. Meteorology reports wind shear at flight level 3 to 5. If we deviate now, we can reduce the impact." Jordan pressed a button on the autopilot panel. His voice flat, so flat, it drained every warning of its weight. "A deviation wastes fuel. 15 degrees is too much. We stay on course. It's just thick cloud." But Liam began again. Jordan cut clean through the sentence. "Perez, I said stay on course." Once again, no collaboration, just a command. Liam swallowed his words. He wasn't a man who enjoyed confrontation, especially not inside a cockpit where cooperation mattered more than pride. But the radar was clear, and his instincts were screaming. If this can be avoided, why not avoid it? The question spun in his mind. In business class, Maya was reading a digital newspaper when the shifting light caught her eye. The sky outside had darkened significantly. Thick clouds swallowed what remained of the sun, shading the cabin in a cold gray. Several passengers glanced out their windows, then at each other, nervousness creeping into their expressions. Minutes later, the first tremor hit. It was light at first, like someone shaking your shoulder to wake you. But within seconds, the turbulence escalated, jerking the aircraft sharply. Karen immediately switched on the PA. "Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts. We are entering a zone of light turbulence." But Karen knew this was not light. A passenger in 3B let out a startled gasp as water sloshed over the rim of his cup. An elderly woman clutched her daughter's hand. The air grew heavy, like everyone was waiting for something worse. The aircraft jolted again, harder this time. Small gasps broke out across the cabin. Karen hurried past Maya to check the rows up front. Though her face remained calm, her hand clamped tightly around the safety rail, a reflex she used only when things were truly concerning. Maya watched every detail, the tremors, the fear whispering through the cabin, the sound of nervous breaths. She stayed composed, but somewhere deep inside, a quiet tide began to rise. She knew this kind of turbulence, not minor, not dismissible, not something a commander should gamble with. She opened her notebook, pen hovering, waiting. Inside the cockpit, the scene was starkly different. Liam's hand tightened around the side stick, a crease forming between his brows. Captain, wind shear is increasing. The cell has expanded. I strongly recommend we divert now. Jordan's tone didn't change an inch. The aircraft can handle it. The 787 is designed for heavy cloud. Don't overreact. But the passengers, Jordan cut him off for the third time that day. You're always worried about the passengers. We're pilots, not cabin crew. The words were so cold, so dismissive that Liam stiffened in disbelief. It wasn't just what Jordan said. It was the way he said it. Jordan wasn't just being stubborn. He was putting ego above the safety and comfort of 200 people. The plane lurched violently, once more hard enough that napkins flew off trays in the front cabin. A scream came from somewhere near the back. Even Maya had to brace against her armrest. Inside her, the still lake finally rippled, not from fear but from disappointment. A great leader isn't the one who never makes mistakes, she thought. It's the one who listens before the mistake becomes irreversible. She had known people like Jordan, people who trusted instinct so much they dismissed procedure. People who believed experience gave them absolute authority. People who didn't realize arrogance could be more dangerous than any storm. Liam leaned toward the radar again, voice low and shaking, not from fear, but from restrained frustration. Captain, a 15-degree deviation only adds about 3 minutes of flight time and barely affects fuel. Should Jordan turn his eyes hard. As Steel Perez, I am the pilot in command. You are here to assist. I said no deviation. That's final. No room for dialogue. No space for reason. No chance for Liam to do what he believed was right. The cockpit fell silent, the kind of silence that squeezes the lungs. Eventually, the turbulence subsided. The sky brightened. The aircraft steadied. Passengers sighed in relief. Karen managed a reassuring smile. Liam loosened his shoulders, but not his worry. And Maya, she stared at the blank page in her notebook for one more breath. Then, she wrote, Captain is stubborn. Refused course adjustment despite clear risk to passenger comfort. Ego prioritized over situational safety considerations. Her handwriting was firmer this time, more defined. Not from anger, but because she finally saw it clearly. The real storm wasn't outside the aircraft. It was sitting in the left seat of the cockpit. Once the aircraft cleared the turbulence, the cabin loosened up as if someone had finally released a hell breath. Passengers began chatting again, a few laughing shakily to brush off the fear while Karen moved through the aisle, collecting fallen napkins and cups. Outside the window, the late afternoon light slowly spread across the sky, like a gentle cloth laid over the world after a storm. But inside Maya, the storm had not settled. She closed her notebook. The lines she had written, cold, factual, clinical, rested quietly behind the leather cover like silent beats on the long score of a life she had lived. A life she had paid more for than most people would ever know, more than she herself sometimes wanted to remember. She leaned her head back, exhaled slowly, letting her mind drift somewhere far, far away, somewhere old, somewhere that had hurt her but had also strengthened her. In her younger years, Maya never imagined she would one day sit in the CEO seat of a major airline. She had grown up in a poor neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio, where winter winds slipped through thin wooden walls and made the whole house tremble. Her mother worked 2 jobs, her father drove long-haul trucks, and real family dinners only happened on Sundays. And Maya always dreamed bigger. Not in a glamorous way. Her dreams began with afternoons sitting by the window, watching airplanes carve white trails across the sky, and wondering why she felt free just by looking at something that didn't belong to the world she lived in. In college, she worked 3 jobs to pay tuition, serving coffee in the mornings, staffing the library in the afternoons, and cleaning hotel rooms on weekends. She counted every tip like she was counting down the seconds until she could step into the aviation world. But there was one thing she didn't anticipate. The world she worked so hard to reach wasn't always willing to open its doors to her. Maya remembered the first time she applied to Liberty Air at 23. The hiring manager, a silver-haired man with thin, metal-framed glasses, studied her arse, then looked up at her with an expression she would never forget. There was no malice in his eyes, but there was something worse: judgment. "You have a strong worse," he said. "But you understand this role is usually better suited for someone with a more professional image." Professional. Maya understood exactly what he meant. Not her degree, not her qualifications. Her color. She walked out of that office with feet that felt like stone, yet somehow she didn't cry. Maya had never allowed anyone to determine her worth. And that was the day she made a promise she had never broken. "One day I will open this door from the inside." Years later, Maya accomplished what nobody expected from a poor black girl with nothing but grit holding her life together. She became a turnaround strategist, helping failing companies rise from the brink. When Liberty Air faced severe financial trouble, they came to her as a last resort, and 2 years after she took the reins under relentless pressure, endless nights, and decisions that tore at her, she was appointed CEO. She didn't celebrate. She just sat still, remembering the small house, remembering her mother bent over bills, remembering every rejection that had nothing to do with merit and everything to do with perception. That's why today, sitting on this flight, as just another passenger, Maya understood something fundamental. In the sky, everyone is equal. The only thing that protects or harms them is the humanity of the person in command. Power, titles, money, status, those all have limits. But humanity does not. And Captain Jordan Miles had a problem with his. Not because he was incompetent, not because he lacked experience, but because he trusted himself so completely that empathy had become an afterthought and inconvenience. Maya inhaled slowly. She wasn't here to punish anyone. She was here to answer a far bigger question. What culture is Liberty Air truly building? A sky that's safer, a sky ruled by ego. The soft footsteps of Karen brought Maya back to the present. The lead attendant paused beside a row in front, smoothing a tablecloth for a passenger, then let out a tiny sigh. A sigh so subtle, most people would miss it, but Maya recognized it instantly. It was the kind of sigh that comes from a woman who has endured more than her job ever required. Karen glanced briefly at Maya, as if wanting to say something but stopping herself. Maya met her gaze with a gentle look, sending a quiet message: "I know. I understand. I'm here." That small, silent exchange made Maya even more certain. This trip, this secret trip, unknown even to her own board, was the right decision. She turned back toward the window. The sky was clearing, opening into a fresh patch of blue after the thick layers of cloud. Peaceful, but not truly peaceful. Just the calm before something much more important, something Maya knew was still coming. She opened her notebook again, set the pen to the page. But she didn't write. Flight LA 421 still had a long way to go, and what Maya needed to observe wasn't over yet. The sky outside had steadied again, but the sky inside Maya had not. Beneath the surface of her silent reflection, something else was waiting, like the first crack in a cultural audit that had only just begun. What she didn't know was that in only a few minutes, Flight LA 421 would face a completely different kind of test. Not from weather, not from machinery, but from people. And this time, it wouldn't just test character. It would test humanity. Karen was serving drinks to the front rows when a young woman approached, her voice trembling but held together by sheer effort. "Excuse me, Maya and my father. I think he's having chest pain. He says it feels tight, and he can't catch his breath." Karen's expression changed instantly. Not panic, but urgency, the kind only years of handling in-flight emergencies could produce. "Which seat is he in, ma'am?" "Seat 6C. Karen handed her tray to another attendant and moved quickly down the aisle. Maya noticed her hand paused over her notebook. The intuition that had saved her through dozens of high-stakes negotiations whispered, "This isn't going to be simple." The elderly man in 670-something, thin hands trembling, was leaning back in his seat, one hand pressed to his chest. Karen crouched down. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man opened his eyes, breathing shallowly. "Just tightness. Maybe from sitting too long." Karen turned to the daughter. "Does he have a history of heart or blood pressure issues?" "Yes, he had angina a few years ago." Karen nodded. This was no longer minor. I'll notify the flight deck immediately. From business class, Maya watched. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the scene from body language alone, the shift in Karen's posture, the tension in her shoulders, something heavy pressed into Maya's chest. Not fear, anticipation, because in moments like this people show who they really are. And she needed to see who Captain Jordan Miles truly was. Karen pressed the intercom for the cockpit. Flight deck, this is Karen. We have a passenger reporting chest, discomfort possibly cardiac-related, requesting medical assistance protocol. In the cockpit, Liam turned sharply toward Jordan. Jordan didn't look at Karen, didn't look at Liam. He simply replied, cold and clipped, noted. Karen continued, voice calm, but urgent, I'll need guidance. And please consider descending if necessary. Lower altitude can help stabilize elderly passengers. Jordan pressed the intercom button again, this time to disconnect it, then leaned back in his seat. Liam stared at him. Captain, why did you cut her off? Jordan's tone was chillingly casual. Perez, we're at a stable flight level. A plane is not a hospital. Old passengers get chest pain, it happens. Let the cabin crew handle it. A chill ran through Liam's spine. But sir, if it's cardiac-related, descending could ease pressure and improve breathing. Medical guidelines. Jordan cut him off again, colder than before. I'm not changing altitude because one person feels a little sick. This isn't a little sick, Liam insisted. Rare for him. Karen said, cardiac-related. If we don't assist, Jordan swiveled fully toward him, eyes sharp enough to make even the calmest person falter. Perez, I am the commanding officer of this flight, not the flight attendant, not you, and certainly not some elderly passenger. Liam froze, not from fear, but from shock. Outside the cockpit, Karen stood staring at the closed door for a single silent second, and it was enough for Maya to catch the pain in her eyes. The look of someone who knew they'd just been dismissed. The look of someone forced to keep smiling even when their hearts sank. Karen returned to the cabin, calm on the outside, but shaken on the inside. Maya tightened her grip around her notebook, not because she was angry, but because she was profoundly disappointed. She had hoped Jordan was simply rough around the edges, but now she could see something far more dangerous. He wasn't just lacking tact. He was blind to the responsibility that came with power. Karen knelt back at row 6C. We're looking for any medically trained passengers. In the meantime, I'm getting oxygen support for him. Her voice stayed steady, but Maya saw the faint tremble in her eyes. Karen had expected more cooperation from the flight deck. As she opened the medical kit, Maya watched. She didn't intervene, didn't pull rank. She wanted to see how Liberty Air would respond without the CEO standing behind them. And what she saw, what she felt, weighed heavier on her by the minute. Because she understood exactly what being dismissed felt like. She had lived through boardrooms where white male executives gave her the same look Jordan gave Liam, as if her voice wasn't worth hearing. As if her perspective didn't matter. As if she had to earn the right to speak in rooms where others were handed that right by default. She remembered sitting through conversations masked as professional concerns, comments that sounded harmless but hit like stones. Are you sure you're right for this role? We were hoping for someone with a stronger presence, and now at 30,000 feet, she was watching that cycle replay itself, but with real consequences, real risk, real human lives in the balance. In the cockpit, Liam tried once more. Captain, the passenger's condition could worsen. If needed, we should adjust course to lower altitude. Jordan slammed a hand lightly on the armrest. I said no changes. If the cabin crew can't handle it, that's their problem, not mine. A sentence sharp enough to leave scars on any crew member's heart. Liam stared at his own hands. They were trembling not from fear, but from frustration. I'm just trying to do the right thing. Why does it have to be this hard? He had no idea Maya was watching from the cabin. No idea this entire flight was a closely observed cultural audit orchestrated by the CEO herself. But instinct told him something was deeply wrong. Finally, a nurse seated in row 11 volunteered to assist. Karen thanked her profusely. Maya stood for a moment, prepared to step forward, then chose not to. This wasn't the time for power. This was the time to see what Liberty Air truly was without it. And with Jordan in command, what she saw was heartbreaking. She sat back down, closed her eyes, drew a long breath. Titles can lift a person high, but only humanity determines whether they deserve to stay there. A thin ribbon of disappointment slipped through her heart. Not because Jordan made a mistake, but because he made it with pride. The hardest kind of mistake to fix. After the medical scare, the murmurs in the cabin faded into the steady hum of the engines. Everything seemed stable again, but in the cockpit, a silence larger than the sky itself stretched between Jordan and Liam. Liam stayed silent, eyes fixed on the panels. Karen returned to the cabin, the weight in her chest still unspoken. Maya said nothing, but her gaze was a deep, reflective lake mirroring truths Jordan didn't know were being recorded. And then there was Jordan. He too was silent. But his silence was different. It was the silence of someone raised under pressure. Someone trained to fight alone. Someone who believed the only way to keep the world safe was to rely on no one but himself. And in that strange pocket of calm between the hum of the engines and the soft blue sky out, Jordan's loneliness began to surface like the submerged half of an iceberg he had spent a lifetime hiding. He stared straight ahead, but he wasn't really seeing the flight path. He was seeing a boy. A boy standing beside an old runway on a military base in Texas, squinting under brutal sunlight while an F-16 roared as it lifted off. Look closely, Jordan. A real pilot never lets emotion take control. His father's voice echoed sharp, heavy, unforgiving. As a child, Jordan worshipped the man. His father walked like someone carved from stone, straight-backed, unwavering, never tired, never shaken. To a boy, that wasn't harshness. That was power. But as Jordan grew older, he learned that power came with a price. And he had been taught from the beginning that he must pay it whether he wanted to or not. He let out a breath, quiet, almost imperceptible. His hand rested on the edge of his seat, the weight in his chest, cold and metallic. They don't get it. Nobody does. He never said this aloud, but the pressure inside him didn't come from cabin crew or passengers or protocols he clung to with stubborn devotion. It came from the name Miles. Wherever he went, people spoke of his father first. Whatever he achieved, people said, "Of course he's Colonel Miles' son." Every time Jordan stepped into a cockpit, he heard that invisible echo, the reminder that any mistake, no matter how small, was unacceptable. His father didn't tolerate mistakes. The military didn't tolerate mistakes. And he, the only son, was not allowed to be anything less than perfect. Jordan remembered crying once as a child after watching a failed landing during a training session. His father had pulled him behind the house, placed a firm hand on his shoulder, and said the words that left a permanent mark. "You want to be a pilot? Then learn this first: emotions will bring you down faster than gravity." Jordan grew up in that sentence. He shrank every softness in him. He hid every fear. He stamped out every spark of compassion kids naturally have. Not because he wanted to be cold, but because he never learned any other way to survive. When he moved into commercial aviation, he carried that philosophy the way he carried his father's old pilot watch, polished, rigid, always reminding him that discipline alone kept the sky in order. He used to believe it wholeheartedly, until the world began showing him something else, something that didn't fit into one unbendable rule. But by then, it was too late to change. Jordan stared at the radar without truly seeing it. He knew Liam saw him as stubborn. He knew the cabin crew found him difficult. He knew passengers, if they ever knew, would probably call him heartless. But in his own eyes, he was just trying not to drown. He never spoke his greatest fear because it sounded weak. He feared he would never be as good as his father. He feared that accepting even one small suggestion meant he lacked authority. He feared that letting empathy slip into a critical moment would destroy the perfect pilot image he'd been trained to uphold since childhood. He feared a lot of things. But the biggest fear of all was this: if he shed the cold exterior, people would see he was just human. A human who wasn't always sure. A human who got tired of being strong all the time. He ran a hand along the edge of the flight panel, gesture he had carried since he was 20, back when he was lost and overwhelmed during training. His fingers trembled slightly. No one noticed. A tiny crack in the steel armor he wore. He thought, "I'm not allowed to fail. I'm not allowed to be soft. I'm supposed to do everything exactly the way I was taught." But somewhere deeper, buried far beneath the layers he refused to examine, another question whispered, "Whose life am I living? My father's or my own?" Liam glanced over, about to speak, then stopped. He could feel the heaviness in the cockpit without understanding its origin. Meanwhile, Maya thought she couldn't hear a word being spoken, felt something shifting. She sensed it in Jordan's silence, in his refusal to speak after the incident, in the taut string of tension stretching through the cockpit, thin but unmistakable. and Maya knew. Every storm has a moment of eerie stillness before it breaks. Flight LA 421 glided through the afternoon light. But inside Jordan, the man who believed himself to be unshakable something was beginning to unravel. Something deeper, more dangerous, more human. And that was the real storm. The late afternoon sky, softened sunlight thinning into a golden veil stretching across the wings of Liberty Air's Boeing 787. Though the flight had pushed through turbulence, a medical scare, and the quiet storms inside each person on board, one thing still had not eased: the invisible tension stretched from cockpit to cabin. And as the aircraft began its descent towards Seattle-Tacoma Airport, that tension sharpened, like the whole flight was holding its breath waiting for something. In business class, Maya Thompson opened her eyes after a moment of quiet reflection. Jordan's landing announcement came through the speaker, smooth, clean, textbook perfect, no tremor in his voice, no crack in the polished exterior. Even though inside him the storm, from his unspoken reflection, still churned violently. Maya heard that storm not in his words, but in the silence between them. The silence of a man battling himself without even knowing it. She inhaled calmly and closed her notebook. The flight was nearing its end, but the assessment wasn't. The wheels touched down with a landing so smooth passengers murmured in relief. Jordan had always been a gifted pilot, nobody could dispute that. His precision seemed etched into his DNA, born from years of watching his father take off from the Texas Air Base. But today, that very perfection made the truth hit harder. Skill could not hide the absence of humanity. The aircraft slowed, exited the runway, and taxied toward the gate. Liam read the after-landing checklist, his voice slightly hoarse from a flight spent swallowing frustration. At the front, Karen stood ready to greet passengers as they disembarked. Her practiced smile returned steady, warm, reassuring, though her heart was still bruised from the words in the cockpit. On her face, Maya saw everything others missed: exhaustion, hurt, and a fragile hope that someone somewhere understood. When the plane stopped at the gate, the familiar ding echoed overhead. The doors opened. Passengers rose and filed out. Maya stayed where she was at the front, waiting politely like any courteous passenger. But the truth was waiting for the most important moment of the entire flight. The moment that would reveal who Captain Jordan Miles truly was, more clearly than any checklist, radar, or emergency protocol. A moment where he could no longer hide behind the title of pilot, but stand exposed as a person. Karen approached Maya gently. "Thank you for flying with Liberty Air." She had no idea Maya was the CEO, but the sincerity in her voice made Maya smile. Then Karen lowered her tone, barely louder than a breath. "If you'd like to greet the flight crew, the cockpit is open." Maya's gaze softened yet deepened. "I'm waiting for them." Karen didn't fully understand the answer, but felt the gravity of it. Finally, Jordan and Liam appeared at the cockpit door. Liam came first. He noticed Maya immediately and paused, not because he recognized her, but because of the look she gave him. A look without judgment, without criticism, just understanding. "Thank you for flying with us," Liam said quietly, sincerity threading through every word. "Thank you," Maya replied. Then she turned to Jordan. Time stretched thin tight, like a single drawn string, ready to snap. Both Karen and Liam felt the tension rise. Jordan straightened, adjusted his pilot's cap, posture as rigid as steel. He saw Maya, a calm, reserved black woman with eyes he couldn't quite read. For a split second he hesitated. A small part of him, the part he had spent years burying, wanted to nod, wanted to acknowledge her, wanted to do the simple right thing. But then something inside him closed. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear of seeming uncertain. Maybe it was habit-old, hardened bone deep. Jordan turned away. No greeting. No nod. Not even a glance. Just a cold pivot of the shoulder, turning his back on what might have been his last chance to course correct. Karen's mouth fell open slightly. She couldn't believe it. After everything that had happened, Jordan still did this. Still refused a simple greeting. Still clung to that brittle, needless hardness. Liam lowered his head, shame burning quietly inside him. He knew at certain moments in life, one small action speaks louder than every word ever spoken. Maya watched Jordan walk away. She didn't look angry, or startled, or hurt. She simply smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile no one could decipher. But her eyes were an ocean cooling before a storm. In them lived three truths. Understanding, because she knew the most stubborn people were often the most wounded. Sadness, because she could see the greatness he could have lived up to. Certainty, because she knew this moment had sealed his fate. Not out of vengeance, not out of ego, but because a man who cannot greet a passenger cannot lead an airline responsible for millions of lives. Maya bowed her head to Liam and Karen, then stepped onto the jet bridge. Her heels clicked softly against the floor. Each step a quiet punctuation mark, closing one chapter, ushering in another. And just before she disappeared from sight, Maya thought, it's never the flying skills that define a pilot's career. It's how he treats people. Jordan had repeated his mistake, this time in front of someone who could change his entire life. And Maya knew she would have to do exactly that. After the moment Jordan turned his back on Maya's polite greeting, the entire flight seemed to leave behind a silent, razor-thin aftertaste. Maya walked away calm, but her eyes held the depth of someone who already knew a major shift was coming. Jordan, meanwhile, left the airport with a completely different mindset. He didn't think about the woman at the aircraft door. Didn't think about Karen's stunned expression or Liam's quiet embarrassment. His mind was fixed on one thing: tomorrow, he would be flying to Chicago Liberty Air's headquarters for a meeting with the executive board. And every signal he'd heard over the past few weeks told him one thing: it would be good news. Chicago greeted him with a crisp morning breeze rolling off Lake Michigan, sweeping down streets lined with towering glass buildings. Jordan parked beside Liberty Tower, the iconic blue glass monolith rising from the city's heart. Today, he wore his sharpest uniform, tie perfectly straight, white shirt pressed and immaculate, 4 gold stripes on his shoulders gleaming like they carried the story of his entire career. He paused at the building entrance, adjusted his cap, and drew a long breath. Rumor had it Liberty Air was searching for a new chief pilot, someone to lead the next-generation flight program. A powerful position, a prestigious one, a position worthy of a pilot with his flawless technical record. He dreamed of this for years, though he never admitted it aloud. Just like he never told anyone that every time he thought about his father, he felt the man's shadow was almost too large to step out from. This is my moment. This is where I prove I'm no longer living in his shadow. Jordan whispered the thought to himself as the revolving doors slid open. Inside, the lobby gleamed with polished gray stone and bright white lighting. Employees in suits moved briskly past him. Some recognized him, the pilot known for textbook flying precision and discipline. They nodded, but didn't smile. Jordan blinked, not because he expected praise, but because the silence felt strange. A few people headed toward the elevators. When they noticed him, they stepped aside to let him pass, but their eyes dropped, avoiding his. Jordan frowned. He wasn't used to people avoiding his gaze. He wasn't used to sensing hesitation from colleagues. Maybe they heard the rumors, he reassured himself. Maybe they think I'm about to become chief pilot. That thought brought back a quiet, proud smirk. Yet beneath it a small, unfamiliar unease flickered. On the 48th floor, the hall was long, carpeted gray, lined with frosted glass conference rooms. The brass plaques beside each door gleamed under soft lighting. Jordan walked with confident steps, shoulders squared. Along the way, more employees recognized him. A maintenance supervisor, a young office intern, a flight operations manager. They each greeted him with voices softer than usual, with nods that felt hurried, with eyes that flickered away too quickly. A ripple of wrongness threaded through him. What's going on? But he shook it off. Everyone knew the executive board was meeting today. Everyone felt the high stakes of the new pilot program. Tension in the air was normal. Jordan straightened his jacket again, regained his posture, and stepped into the waiting area. Inside, Martha, a longtime executive assistant of Liberty Air, stood behind her desk. Her silver hair framed a face etched with decades of experience. She'd worked here since his father's time in the industry. She had known Jordan since he was a bright-eyed young trainee pilot. But when she looked up and saw him, her expression wasn't the one he expected. It wasn't pride. It wasn't warmth. It was something closer to sympathy. And beneath it, something heavy, almost mournful. Jordan stopped. His chest tightened slightly, hearing a warning chime from a system he didn't recognize. "Good morning, Martha," he said, forcing a normal tone. "Good morning, Captain Miles," she replied, her voice quieter than usual. He noticed the formality instantly. "No more Jordan," no familiar smile. He approached her desk. "I'm here for the 10 a.m. meeting with the executive board." Martha nodded but didn't offer him a seat. Instead, she simply looked at him for several seconds, long enough for him to feel the weight of something he couldn't name. Finally, she said, "They're waiting for you in conference room 12. Jordan nodded, readjusted his jacket, and walked toward the room. In his mind, he felt like an athlete walking toward the podium. His heart beat faster, full of expectation. Behind him, Martha watched his back retreating down the hallway. Her expression softened with a kind of quiet sorrow, as if she already knew what was coming. But Jordan never saw it. All he saw was the polished wooden door ahead, a door that in his mind opened into the future. And yet, at the last moment, just before he touched the handle, a chill ran down his spine, a whisper of instinct, a warning he didn't have a name for. But Jordan Miles had lived his entire life ignoring those instincts. He believed he was strong enough, skilled enough, untouchable enough. He believed today was his day. And then he opened the door. The door to the conference room opened with a soft, almost elegant click. A coordination staffer stepped out and offered Jordan a polite smile alone that lasted half a second before fading without a trace. "Captain Miles, they're ready for you." Jordan nodded, straightened, his cap smoothed the last crease on his uniform, and stepped inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, every sound disappeared. Not because the room was quiet, but because the sight before him wiped his mind clean. A long rectangular table stretched across the center, its polished surface reflecting the ceiling lights like a sheet of still water. 12 board members sat in their places. But at the head of the table in the chair's seat sat Maya Thompson. No travel blazer, no quiet passenger demeanor. Today she wore a sharp black suit, every line perfectly cut, the overhead lights carving a commanding silhouette across her shoulders. Her face was composed, her expression unreadable, and her eyes were the calm of deep midnight water, still reflective and capable of showing you every crack you tried to hide. Jordan froze. His jaw tightened, his heartbeat stuttered. No, this couldn't be real. He inhaled sharply, but the air caught halfway down, burning his chest. On the right side of the table sat Liam Perez. He didn't look at Jordan, he looked down, shame tugging at the corners of his expression. On the left sat Karen Douglas. No cabin crew uniform now, she wore a professional suit, her hands tightly clasped. Her eyes, the same ones that had silently pleaded with Jordan mid-flight, now held a deeper sadness and disappointment. Jordan felt as if someone had slammed the cockpit door shut right in front of him. No warning, no checklist, no training to prepare for this. He stood frozen. Several board members watched him with inscrutable expressions. Some looked at him, direct, cool, reserved. Others looked down at documents as if to soften the blow. But one thing was certain, no one looked pleased to see him. Jordan swallowed. His throat felt dry, grainy. "Please take a seat, Captain Miles." That voice, low, steady, not raised, not lowered yet, somehow powerful enough to make the entire room shift toward it. Jordan turned to Maya. And in that brief moment, a truth tore through every layer of confidence he'd brought with him. She was not a passenger. She was not a bystander. She was the one evaluating him, the one with the authority to shape or end his future. He pulled out the chair and sat. His spine stayed rigid, not from confidence, but because he could feel himself falling, and sitting straight was the only way to keep from collapsing. Maya opened her notebook, the same one he'd seen on the flight. Quietly, effortlessly. Jordan's stomach twisted. She scanned a page, then lifted her eyes, calm, unhurried, devastating in their precision. "Captain Miles," she began, "we met on flight LA 421. Jordan forced air into his lungs, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yes, ma'am." Maya continued, tone unchanged. "I observed your conduct from boarding until landing. I will now recount what I documented." Jordan didn't move, didn't blink. His heart hammered against his ribs. Maya flipped to the first page. Note 1, boarding. Her voice sliced through every defense he'd ever built. "You ignored my greeting, not because you were busy with pre-flight protocols, but because you made a choice not to acknowledge it." Jordan opened his mouth. Maya cut him off gently. "But with finality, it is not problematic because it was impolite. It is problematic because you ignored a passenger's communication, the very people whose safety and experience you are entrusted with." Jordan's hands tightened around the armrests. She turned to the next page. Note 2, interaction with colleagues. She read aloud each line. Another strike. You dismissed First Officer Perez's weather avoidance recommendation. You demonstrated a pattern of verbal disrespect. You issued commands based on impulse rather than checklist procedure. You created a dangerous cockpit gradient. Every sentence landed with the weight of cold metal. Jordan's breathing grew shallow. He looked at Liam. Liam didn't meet his gaze. Not because he was angry, but because he was embarrassed for Jordan. Page 3. Note 3, medical emergency. The room shifted. Even the air felt heavier. Jordan wanted to speak anything to stop her from reading. But he couldn't. I recorded your exact response when the lead flight attendant reported a potential cardiac event. Maya looked at her notes. Silence thickened until Jordan could hear the faint hum of the vents overhead. She read, "We are not a hospital." A few board members raised their brows. Someone exhaled sharply. Jordan shut his eyes, just for a heartbeat, but enough for the entire room to see. He wasn't defending himself. He wasn't posturing. He was processing the reality of his own words. Maya continued, "Captain, passengers do not need you to be a doctor. They need you to respect their fear." Her tone remained calm, which somehow hurt more than anger ever could. Page 4. Note 4 to planning. Jordan's fingers turned white from gripping the chair so tightly. Maya read the final line. Captain Miles turned his back when greeted. No elaboration, no embellishment, but everyone in the room understood. Sometimes the quietest insult is the loudest wound. Jordan's throat closed. He wanted to say something, a justification, an apology, a confession, but nothing came out. He had never felt smaller, never felt the world tilt so unmistakably away from him. Maya closed her notebook. She placed it on the table with a softness that to Jordan felt like the sound of his entire career sealing shut. She looked directly at him, not with anger, not with triumph, just with truth. "Captain Miles," she said softly, "your flying skills are excellent, exceptional even." A flicker of hope stirred in him. But Liberty Air does not only need aircraft operators. We need leaders of people. She tilted her head slightly, voice lowering. Leadership is not about being obeyed. It is about being trusted. The words rippled through the room like a stone dropped into a perfectly still lake. Jordan felt his chest tighten painfully. He understood. Not because she raised her voice, but because she didn't have to. Maya continued, and this time her eyes held something faintly sorrowful. "You did not lose this opportunity because you lack skill. You lost it because you failed to respect the people who work beside you. And because you did not understand that sometimes one simple greeting can save an entire flight." Jordan bowed his head, not out of shame before the board, but because he finally saw himself clearly, and what he saw hurt. The room stayed silent. Karen looked at him not with anger, but with a mournful compassion. Liam looked at him not with resentment, but with a heavy regret for what could have been avoided. From the doorway, Martha watched, knowing this moment would change Jordan forever. And Maya remained steady, calm, firm, fair. That calmness burned more than any reprimand ever could. Jordan realized the truth. The moment he turned his back on a passenger, he set his own downfall in motion. And now that moment had come full circle. This time, nothing could shield him from the truth. After Maya finished speaking, the air in the conference room thickened like early morning fog over Lake Michigan. No one moved. No one dared breathe too loudly. Jordan sat frozen, as if he'd just been ripped out of the one place he'd always felt in control. Not the cockpit, but the illusion that he was the one steering everything. Now in front of him, there were no familiar buttons, no warning lights to guide him, only eyes. And the truth. Maya slid her notebook aside and laced her fingers together. She tilted her head, slightly, voice soft yet unwavering. "Before the board reaches a conclusion, I want to hear from the people who actually worked with you. They deserve to be heard." Jordan shifted. He knew whatever came next would be heavy, but he didn't expect it to cut this deep. Maya turned to Karen. Lead flight attendant Karen Douglas drew a deep breath and stood up. The black suit she wore made her look very different from the warm, smiling woman who had spent years welcoming passengers aboard. Today, there was something stronger in her eyes, a quiet resolve, balanced delicately with unhealed hurt. "On flight LA 421, Karen began, I didn't just do my job. I had to soothe fears that should never have been triggered in the first place. Jordan swallowed. He wasn't used to hearing Karen like this. She wasn't accusing him, but her honesty was so direct it made his spine go cold. Karen continued. When the elderly passenger started having chest pain, I was hoping for support from the cockpit. Not because I couldn't handle it, but because the passenger's sense of safety depends on how the entire crew responds. She paused for a brief moment. Her eyes met Jordan's. But all I heard was, "We are not a hospital." A faint sigh rippled across the room from somewhere no one could quite tell. But it landed squarely on Jordan's chest, like a hand squeezing his heart. Karen placed her hand on the table, her voice dropping lower. The passengers didn't hear that sentence. Thankfully, because if they had, I don't know where their trust in Liberty Air would have gone. Jordan stared down at the polished wood. His throat tightened. Something heavy lodged right in the middle of it. Karen finished, her voice soft enough to hurt. "Am not angry at you, Captain Miles. I'm just disappointed." That one word, disappointed, hit him harder than any shouted accusation could have. It sounded like a door closing. Maya nodded slightly, then turned to Liam. "First Officer Perez, your turn." Liam rose to his feet. He looked at Jordan, not to challenge him, not to avoid him, but with the gaze of someone who had been hurt enough to no longer be afraid, yet was still kind enough not to want to make it worse. His voice was rough, as if every sentence had to climb over a bruise. "I used to see Captain Miles as a role model. I thought that if I worked hard enough, one day, I'd carry myself with the same confidence he did." Jordan lifted his head, startled. He had never known Liam saw him that way. Liam continued, "But on that last flight, I felt like I didn't exist. My input, right or wrong, was dismissed before I could even finish my sentences." He clenched his hands lightly. His voice didn't shake, but it touched something deeply human. "When I looked out through the cockpit door at the passengers, I realized they were putting their lives in our hands. And I was scared, not because of the sky outside, but because the gap between me and the person in command felt too big." Jordan felt a sharp sting in his chest. He had always believed his toughness created order. He had never realized that same toughness made the person beside him feel small. Liam concluded, "Captain Miles, I never wanted to go against you. I just wanted to feel like I was part of the flight." Silence dropped over the table again, heavy enough that Jordan had to grip the edge of his chair to stop his hands from shaking. After Karen and Liam spoke, Maya turned back to Jordan. She didn't push. She didn't judge. She just waited. And that waiting for someone who had lived his whole life under pressure felt heavier than any interrogation. Jordan inhaled. For the first time since the meeting began, he spoke. His voice was no longer sharp, no longer cold, no longer carefully controlled. It was the voice of a man whose last layer of armor had just fallen off. He stopped, swallowing again. "I didn't know I was hurting people." Liam lowered his head. Karen looked down at her hands. A few board members exhaled quietly, as if they'd been holding their breath, waiting to hear those exact words. Jordan went on, his voice quieter. "I thought keeping my distance was the best way to maintain discipline. I thought never showing weakness was the best way to protect the flight." He let out a small, humorless laugh, one that hurt more than crying. "But all this time, I was just hiding from my own fear." Maya's expression didn't soften completely, but something in her gaze shifted. Jordan placed a hand over his chest as if his heart had suddenly become too heavy. "I didn't know a simple greeting could matter that much. I didn't realize that silence was also a way of hurting people." He lifted his eyes and looked at Karen, then at Liam, then at Maya. "And I didn't realize that when I turned my back, I was turning my back on the people who trusted me." No one spoke, not because they were judging him, but because they were listening to a man who, for the first time in his life, was finally being honest with himself. Jordan exhaled a long breath that seemed to carry years of tension out with it. "I'm sorry." His voice broke slightly. "I'm sorry, I didn't see what I should have seen." Maya looked at him for a long time, long enough that Jordan felt she could see right through him. Past the uniform, past the rank, past the Texas childhood, the military base, the shadow of Colonel Miles. Finally, she spoke slowly. "Captain Miles, what matters isn't whether you're strong or weak. What matters is whether you see what you've done and whether you want to change." Jordan bowed, his head lower than before. Not in defeat, but in the first real act of acknowledgement, the first honest surrender of his life. The moment Jordan bowed his head and finally acknowledged his mistakes, The room fell into a very specific kind of silence note, the tense kind that comes with confrontation, nor the heavy kind of judgment. It was the silence of a door about to close, but not yet locked. Maya studied him for a long moment. The entire board seemed to be waiting for the final sentence, waiting for the ending, or for an unexpected turn. She placed both hands on the table, leaned forward slightly, and spoke with a calm that made her intentions impossible to guess. Captain Miles, she began, Liberty Air does not believe in destroying people. But we also do not allow any, no matter how skilled to stand outside the core values of this company. Jordan held his breath. It felt like every cell in his body was listening. Maya continued, you made serious mistakes. Not because you lack skill, but because you forgot the essence of a leader. Jordan swallowed hard, his throat, so dry it almost stung. A board member to the left jumped in. With everything that's been documented, immediate termination would be completely justified. Jordan's heart clenched. He didn't cry, he had never allowed himself to cry, but a cold sting crept down his spine. Maya raised a hand, stopping the board member mid-sentence. Then she turned back to Jordan, speaking slowly, clearly. But I do not support terminating you. Jordan blinked. For a moment he thought he misheard her. Karen's head lifted. Liam leaned forward a little. The entire room shifted, tension dissolving into surprise. Maya went on, as if she had just dropped a stone into a perfectly still lake and was now watching the ripples spread. You will not be removed from Liberty Air. You will not lose your wings. Jordan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. She paused, the kind of pause that suspends a person's entire world. But Maya said, enunciating each word, you will be grounded for 90 days. Jordan let out a breath, uncertain whether it was relief or something far heavier. Maya didn't give him long to linger in that feeling. During those 90 days, you will undergo a full leadership rehabilitation program. That includes a complete retraining in CRM protocol, leadership and passenger-centric decision-making courses, psychological evaluation, and direct work sessions with our cabin crew team. Karen lifted her head, almost shocked that Jordan was being given a real chance to repair what he'd broken. Liam exhaled deeply, almost like release. And Jordan, he felt as if he'd just been pulled back from the edge of a cliff, not safely onto solid ground, but onto a narrow ledge where he could still stand if he chose his steps carefully. He wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or ashamed. Maybe both. Maya looked straight at him, not angry, not cold, just honest. You don't have to become a different person overnight, Jordan, but you must start learning how to lead again. Jordan bowed his head, not out of defeat, but because for the first time in many years he finally understood something. Some people are strong because they know how to forgive, no because they're weak. Maya closed one of the files and slid it aside. And one more thing, she added. Jordan looked up. The chief pilot position, the one you assumed might be yours. She paused, not for drama, but to give him room to face what was coming. Will be given to someone else. Jordan didn't need her to say the name. He already knew. He had known for a while. Liam Perez, Maya finished. He doesn't just have the skill. He has what you've been missing, trust from the people around him. Jordan closed his eyes. There was no resistance, no argument, just acceptance. It hurt, but it was the kind of hurt that grows a person. The kind of hurt adults must face to rise again. A board member leaned forward and asked gently, Captain Miles, do you have anything you'd like to say? Jordan opened his eyes. This time, there was no pride, no detachment, just a man stripped of every layer of armor he'd carried for years. He spoke slowly, each word pulled from somewhere deep within. I'm not going to excuse myself. I'm not going to defend what I did. I accept this decision. He looked at Maya's sincerity, filling the space between them. Thank you for not ending my career today. Maya offered a small smile, one without victory, without pity, just a reminder that sometimes all a person needs is someone to believe they can change. Jordan, she said, setting aside the title captain for the first time, I'm not saving you. I'm showing you the edge. Whether you step forward or step back is entirely up to you. Jordan nodded. He understood. This wasn't mercy. This was a chance, a harder challenge than any flight he'd ever taken. When he rose from his seat, his legs trembled slightly, but his stride was steadier than when he first entered the room. No one applauded. No one cheered. No one reached out to pat his back. But no one turned away from him either. And sometimes that's exactly how hope begins. 3 months had passed since that fateful meeting in Chicago, 3 months that felt like a long, relentless rainy season. Heavy gray, uncomfortable, yet quietly nurturing something new beneath the surface. For Jordan, they were 3 months with no sky, no cockpit, no familiar hum of engines, only silence. And in that silence, he finally began to hear his own voice. On the first morning of his suspension, Jordan woke up automatically at 4:45 a.m. But instead of putting on his uniform, brewing his usual strong coffee, and heading to the airport, he found himself standing at the window of his small Chicago apartment, watching the still sleepy streets glow under the last traces of dawn. An empty feeling washed over him. His heart was racing as if his body still believed today was going to be a long-haul day. But it wasn't. There was no flight, no passengers, no crew waiting for him. Only an email from HR outlining his new scheduled day 1 CRM, refresher behavioral and communication training. A class he would have mocked 3 months ago, something he thought was for the soft-hearted. Today, it was the beginning of a journey he couldn't outrun. The classroom held only 6 people. No one knew who he was, and he didn't want them to. The instructor, Dr. Abigail Moria, specialist in aviation, psychology, opened with a gentle question. In the cockpit, what makes you feel out of control? The question froze him. Jordan was used to questions like altitude, stable fuel count. What's the crosswind on the runway? Not emotional questions. He stayed silent for nearly a minute. Dr. Moore didn't push. She simply waited, calm and warm, like someone who had seen through 100 pilots hiding their fears behind discipline. Finally, Jordan whispered, "I'm afraid of being wrong." She nodded, unsurprised. "And what do you do to hide that fear?" Jordan swallowed. "I try to look like no one can affect me. More specifically, I keep my distance. I don't want anyone to see me hesitate." Dr. Moore smiled softly without a hint of mockery. "Distance isn't strength, Jordan. Sometimes it's just fear wearing armor." Jordan went still. No one had ever said it so plainly. No one had ever dared to touch that part of him. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't resist. As part of the 90-day program, Jordan had weekly therapy. During the third session, Dr. Moore asked, "Do you believe most of your personality comes from wanting to please your father?" The question hit him like a blast of cold air. He thought about Colonel Benjamin Miles. The stiff mornings, the quiet expectations, the looks that were never quite approval, just pressure. "I think so," Jordan said softly. "Do you feel like you're living his life, not yours?" Jordan stared at his own hands. Hands that had controlled tons of metal in the sky. Hands that once trembled at the thought of disappointing a man who never said, "I'm proud of you." And now, they were trembling for a different reason. Maybe, he admitted. "Doctor." Moore tilted her head, her eyes warm but sharp. "Jordan, you don't have to be a replica of your father to be a great pilot." That sentence cracked something open inside him. For the first time in his life, Jordan asked himself, is the path I'm on actually mine? Or did I inherit it, like a uniform I never chose? Another module tested interaction skills. One person played the FO, another played the lead flight attendant. They gave suggestions during an abnormal scenario. Jordan's assignment: do not interrupt for 60 seconds. Just listen. Listening, so simple for most people. For Jordan, it was torture. He had to sit still, had to let others speak, had to receive instead of command. When time ran out, Dr. Moore asked, "What did that feel like?" Jordan let out a breathy laugh, a laugh tinged with self-awareness, like sitting still in the middle of a storm. She placed a hand gently on her notebook. "That wasn't a storm, Jordan. That was people. Real people. And all they wanted was to be heard." Jordan stared at her. He had always assumed he carried the heaviest pressure in the cockpit. Maybe the people flying with him had been carrying him. The realization hurt, but in the way growth often does. Maya never met Jordan during the 90 days. She wanted him to face himself, not her shadow. But she received weekly reports. Week 6, Jordan has begun lowering his tone when speaking. This suggests he's letting go of his emotional armor. Week 8, he apologized unprompted, a significant behavioral shift. Week 10, he now recognizes the difference between controlling and leading. A major breakthrough. Maya read each line like reading a growth journal of someone learning to be human again. She didn't rush. She didn't judge. She had been through her own battles with prejudice, with expectations, with the world and herself. She understood. But she waited because real change cannot be forced. The final assessment took place in a full-flight simulator. This time, Jordan walked in, not as a man above others, but as someone who knew a flight's safety rested on every voice in the cockpit, not just his. The FO played Liam. The FA played Karen. A mild engine warning scenario was thrown at him. Before Jordan would have said, "I've got it." "Today," he said, "Liam, what do you see? Talk me through your read." His voice wasn't loud or clipped. It was steady, grounded. When the FA expressed concern about anxious passengers, Jordan replied, "Tell them we're managing the situation. And if anyone needs reassurance, I'll come out and speak with them myself." Behind the glass window, the observers, including Maya, exchanged subtle nods. There was no performance, no bravado, just a human being, a changed human being. When the evaluation ended, Maya opened the door. Jordan stood still, not avoiding her, not shrinking back. Maya studied him for a moment, then asked, "How do you feel?" Jordan answered honestly, "I think for the first time in my life, I flew without trying to prove anything." A small smile touched Maya's lips. "And do you feel ready to return to the sky?" Jordan drew a deep breath. He didn't rush. He didn't posture. Finally, he said, "I don't know if I'm perfect, but I know I won't fly alone anymore." Maya nodded. This time, her smile carried warmth and depth. Then, "Welcome back, Captain Miles." Jordan bowed, his head not out of defeat, but out of gratitude. And just like that, after a long season of rain, the sky opened for him again, not as a throne he once believed he deserved, but as a new road he could finally walk with his own heart leading the way. 3 months of retraining ended like a journal full of pages no one but Jordan had ever seen. Some pages felt as heavy as winter wind, others as light as early summer rain. And when the program concluded, Jordan walked out of the training center with a feeling he had never known, not pride, not fear, but peace. One misty April morning in Chicago, he received the email. "Your return to flight date is officially approved." He stood in front of the screen for a long time, letting the words soak in. No rush, no anxiety, just gratitude. And when his first flight day finally arrived, he woke not with the pressure to prove something, but with the quiet desire to do right for the passengers, for his team, and for himself. Then, today was the moment he began fitting those pieces back together into someone more whole. Not the strongest version of himself, but the truest. Jordan arrived at the airport earlier than usual. Not to project authority like before, but simply because he wanted time to breathe inside the empty aircraft, to feel again the place that had once been his entire world. When he stepped onto the Boeing 787, he laid a hand on the cool metal doorframe, a small ritual older pilots swear brings good luck to every journey. He smiled, not the forced smile of a man holding status, but the quiet smile of someone stepping into a new chapter of his life. In the forward cabin, FO Liam Perez, now the newly appointed chief pilot, stepped forward to greet him. "Welcome back to the skies, Captain," Liam said, his voice both respectful and warm. Jordan nodded with genuine appreciation. "Thank you, Liam. Truly." The awkwardness that once sat between them was gone. What remained was something new, respect, born not from hierarchy, but from honesty. A moment later, Karen appeared from the galley, clipboard in hand. She paused, studying Jordan for a few seconds, then smiled. "We missed you. Not the old version of you. The one standing here today." Jordan dipped his head. "I missed all of you too." As boarding began, Jordan stood at the cockpit door. Not like before, standing to appear in control while avoiding interaction. Today, he stood there to welcome anyone who happened to glance his way. Footsteps echoed softly through the cabin. Jordan looked up. Maya. She wore a navy suit, elegant and understated. Her expression calm, her gaze sharp as ever but softened by something new, something almost like pride. She stopped in front of the cockpit. Jordan drew a steady breath and spoke in the warm, sincere tone he had learned through months of looking inward. "Welcome aboard, Miss Thompson." A real smile touched Maya's lips, not the polished smile of a CEO, but the smile of someone who has waited a long time to see someone rise to their potential. She answered softly, this time, "I trust you." It wasn't loud, but to Jordan, it echoed louder than any Rolls-Royce engine during takeoff. As the aircraft pushed back and taxied toward the runway, Jordan looked at the control panel with different eyes. Not the eyes of a man trying to dominate the sky, but of someone who had been given a second chance and treasured it with his whole heart. The cabin lights glowed softly. Liam reviewed the checklist. "Jordan, you ready?" Liam asked. Jordan smiled, calm, grounded. "Ready. Let's fly." At 32,000 feet, a small patch of unstable air made the airplane tremble gently. Nothing serious, but enough to startle a few passengers. Once Jordan would have ignored it. Today, he called Karen immediately. "Karen, if anyone seems anxious, let them know. I'll update them shortly." "I'm here." His voice steady, reassuring, human. Karen couldn't help smiling, a smile full of pride. Moments later, Jordan picked up the PA. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're passing through a mild area of turbulence. This is a normal atmospheric condition, and the aircraft is designed to handle it safely. I want you to know that everything is fully under control. If you feel nervous, take a slow breath and remember that we are right here with you." His voice was so warm that passengers in the forward cabin actually applauded softly. Not because he sounded heroic, not because he spoke dramatically, but because they felt safe. Maya glanced at the cockpit camera feed on her seat screen and nodded. That was the pilot Liberty Air needed. And more importantly, that was the man she had believed he could become. When the aircraft touched down with a landing so smooth, it felt like gliding into a cloud. No one on board realized they had witnessed more than a flight. They had witnessed a man return to himself, not the version molded by fear and expectations, but the version shaped by humility, growth, and courage. Jordan removed his headset and sat still for a few quiet seconds. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel triumphant. He simply felt light. And in that stillness, he finally understood. Everyone can make mistakes. What defines us is how we rise after them. One chapter closed, a new one opened. In the sky and inside his heart. In life, it's often the smallest things that speak the loudest: a simple nod, a greeting, a moment of genuine listening for the person beside us. The story of Jordan Miles reminds us that people don't fall because they lack talent. They fall when they lose connection, when they fail to see the worth in others. And that can happen to any of you at any age, at any stage of life. For our older viewers, those who have lived through seasons of highs and lows, this truth becomes even clearer. No matter how far we've come, no matter how successful we've been, or how many times we've stumbled, our humanity is something we must protect every single day. No one is ever too important to apologize. And no one is ever too insignificant to deserve respect. Jordan didn't change because he was punished. He changed because someone opened a door, even a very small one, that allowed him to see himself honestly for the first time in years. And we're no different. Life will always bring moments that force us to slow down, to reflect, to grow into a better version of who we've always wanted to be. That's not failure. That's maturity. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched you, if it reminded you of a moment in your own life, please hit the like button, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe so we can continue exploring meaningful human stories together. Thank you for being here. And wherever you're headed next, may your journey be a peaceful one.